Maybe you're familiar with Philip K. Dick's 1968 classic sci-fi story, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? Or maybe you're familiar with Blade Runner, the movie that was based on that story. Or maybe you haven't heard of either, but have you heard of Paul Tremblay's Dead but Dreaming of Electric Sheep? Hi, I'm Amanda, and this is Spineless Books, your one-stop spoiler-free shop for all things audiobook. I was very intrigued when I saw the title of Paul Tremblay's new novel. I've never read any of his books, but I'm familiar with his name as an author. I know that he writes often horror-based stories. But the very obvious nod to the 1968 Philip K. Dick book caught my attention. I was very interested to find out what this novel was about, so I got super excited when I saw that it was available as an advanced listener copy from Libro.fm. Thank you to Libro.fm for that opportunity. Let me just come right out and say that this book is super strange. There are two things about it that made it really odd to me. One was its relationship to generative AI. Not that Paul Tremblay used AI to write it, but it very much is examining, almost like through a fictional case study, what can go wrong. So I would clearly put this in the speculative fiction category, which is interesting because several years back it might have been sci-fi, but now it's really very clearly speculative. The other interesting thing is that this book is metafictional, meaning it is a novel that at points to the reader acknowledges that they are reading a novel, and it basically just calls that out. So that was a really unusual experience that I don't have very often. Kind of like breaking the fourth wall. If you're not familiar with the first two stories I mentioned, the Philip K. Dick book and Blade Runner, essentially those are about a man whose job it is to retire AI androids who are almost indistinguishable from humans. And it calls into question a lot of things about empathy and understanding and what makes a human a human. So I immediately assumed that was going to be linked to this story, and it was. I know that Tremblay often writes horror, but this book feels to me like a cautionary tale. It really examines how wrong things can go and how many people just sort of stand by and watch and feel like everything's exciting and okay without anybody saying, whoa, maybe we need to think about this. The opening chapter of this book was so exciting to me that I actually listened to it twice before I moved on. Many years ago, an English teacher taught me that an author tells you everything you need to know at the beginning of their book, and I've taken that advice to heart. So when I left the first chapter feeling a little bit unsettled and confused, but very interested, I thought, let me just repeat this and make sure that I got what I thought I got. And I did. I felt like the first chapter was very clearly someone describing what it's like to be physically living in an AI-generated universe, where things are changing every time you turn your head. There's the person you were talking to, but maybe their face is just a little different this time, or their hair color has changed, or they're wearing a different color outfit. It was so immersive, and I just felt like, whoa, this is weird, yet I understand this language. I did wonder, however, how much that related to the story and why it was important. And I wouldn't say Tremblay made me work particularly hard to get it, but it did take a little bit of time for that to unfold, and it eventually became clear. Actually, interestingly enough, the book asked me if it had become clear at a certain point, which I found really odd. And it pulled me out of the narrative a little bit, but that was its intention, so mission accomplished. Our main character is a woman named Julia. She's a young woman who hasn't quite found her way in life, and her real goal is to be a gamer. And she's semi-professional. I mean, she's made some money at this. She was an alternate on a fancy gaming team at one point. But Julia has a strained relationship with her mother, who happens to be a bigwig at a major innovative tech company. So even though they don't really talk, when Julia gets a call from her mom about a job opportunity, she answers the call. It turns out Julia is very well suited for what her mother needs help with, and she doesn't really understand that fully until she gets there. And once she gets there, she doesn't really have a choice either. Julia is being asked to remote control a brain-dead man's body that has been implanted with AI technology across the country so he can get to a right-to-die state. She's being asked to remote control a human in broad daylight. Yeah, It's weird. There was so much tension and just discomfort listening to the mechanics of how this had to work and what Julia had to do, and like, was he gonna bump his head, and how do you make him sit and move to the side? All kinds of things that were just nuts. And I felt very engaged by those sections of the story. Right away, the book asks you, like Julia is doing, to question whether or not what she's been told is the full truth. And that becomes a theme throughout the story. The more you go, the more you wonder, was this really what's happening, or is there an ulterior motive here? It was especially weird when the book was asking you what you thought about those things. And in the audio version, those parts were narrated by a really schmaltzy, kind of like salesman-y narrator, and again, it pulled you out, but it was so intentional that it was hard to ignore. I really enjoyed what this book asked me to think about. Where does empathy cross paths with AI? Where do our rights begin and end? And how manipulation and temptation work hand in hand? My big beef with the story was that I didn't feel like Julia was really a well-developed character. She becomes developed through her actions in the story, and that works well. But prior to that, she was really just sort of a young person with traits, like the fact that she loves the Big Lebowski. And that, for me, didn't make enough of a character. But what I lacked in a vividly dimensional person actually worked to my advantage in a weird way, because it put me in the driver's seat in the story. I felt like I was Julia, and as speculative fiction asks you to do, I thought I was thinking about what I would be doing in those situations. So in a weird way, while I didn't love her lack of development, I think it worked to suit the story. I think the book succeeds most where it turns AI from an abstract concept to a really visceral experience. I'm not really going to remember the technology about this book, but the sort of ick that I felt as I listened to what was going on is something that will stick with me. And I think we have to kind of feel that ick with AI just a little bit in order to know that we have some questions. There's a lived instability in this book and misread signals and all kinds of things like borrowed agency and moral distance. I think the novel's power comes less from complete characters and more from incomplete humans that are in a completely ethical dilemma that is fully developed. The book asks where technology blurs responsibility, and it also lets technology serve, in this case, as a warning. I gave this book 4 stars. I didn't love it, but I loved what it made me think about. And it wasn't a bad read. It moved quickly, I enjoyed the pace of it, I was curious what was going to happen. It just didn't really land as a fully developed novel for me, but I do think it's worth reading because of what it makes you ask. I'm not sure the content of this book would be appealing to everyone, but I think if you have a book club that likes to discuss books like this, either speculative fiction or sci-fi, which this does closely approach, I think it's worth it. There's a lot going on today that is being brought up in this story, and Tremblay is thinking about issues that frankly are important for us to be talking about. This book didn't scare me, but it did make the hair on the back of my neck stand up several times, and I think Paul Tremblay is asking important questions that I want to be part of the dialogue of. So if you've read it, or you're planning on reading it, let me know in the comments. I'd love to discuss the issues in this story with you. Of course, we can also discuss what you thought of the book, but I'm very curious to see how others react to this. This one makes it really clear that science fiction has become real life. But remember, you might love what I hate and hate what I love, so make your own opinion, but thanks for listening to mine.